Sandra Green, a black woman in her 50s, lives a quiet life in her small town in Georgia. Widowed a few years ago, she dedicated her life to hard work and raising her only son, Michael. From an early age, Michael demonstrated unusual intelligence and a passion for technology that set him apart from other kids. Sandra always did everything she could to provide the best education for him, even facing financial difficulties and social prejudices. Now, Michael is one of Silicon Valley's most promising entrepreneurs, having founded a successful startup that is changing the technology landscape. He insists that his mother travel to San Francisco to attend an important ceremony where he will be honored. To do so, Michael buys Sandra a business class ticket, wanting her to have the comfort she has always deserved, but which she has rarely experienced. Sandra, with her usual modesty, feels a little out of place with all this attention and luxury. On the day of her trip, she dresses simply but elegantly in a navy blue dress and a wool coat. Upon arriving at the airport, she feels a mix of pride and nervousness. This will be her first time in business class, a completely different world to what she is used to. Upon arriving at the check-in counter, Sandra notices the attendant's hesitation when she sees her ticket. It's a quick look, almost imperceptible, but it carries with it years of disguised prejudice. The attendant, a young white woman with a forced smile, hands Sandra the boarding pass with mechanical courtesy, without the warmth she reserved for the other passengers ahead of her. Sandra takes a deep breath and moves on, determined not to let this little incident ruin her trip. After passing through security, she heads to the VIP room. There, she is once again received with discreet looks, as if her presence there was not expected. Despite this, she sits in a seat by the window, watching the planes on the runway and thinking about how the world has changed since the difficult days when she could barely make ends meet. All this thanks to her son, who with determination and talent built a bright future for himself and for herself. While waiting for boarding time, Sandra mentally revisits all the difficult times they faced together. From the time they had to fight the disbelief of teachers and classmates who didn't see potential in Michael, to the sacrifices she made to ensure he could attend a good college. These thoughts fill her with pride, but they also remind her of the ongoing challenges she still has to face. Finally, boarding is announced. Sandra heads to the gate, where once again she notices the curious and even incredulous looks of other passengers. When she reaches her seat in business class, the flight attendant, a middle-aged man, regards her with slight disdain before indicating her seat. Sandra settles in and, with a calm smile, decides that she won't let these little prejudices get to her. She is there to celebrate her son's achievements, and nothing will make her feel inferior. The plane takes off, and Sandra relaxes in the comfortable seat. But little does she know that this trip is about to turn into an experience that will change her life forever. During the flight, Sandra begins to feel more at ease. The service is impeccable, and she allows herself to savor the small luxuries on offer. However, a figure sitting across the hall catches her attention. She is a sophisticated-looking white woman who observes her intensely, almost disconcertingly. Sandra tries to ignore it, but feels the woman's gaze on her several times during the flight. After the meal, when the atmosphere calms down, the woman finally leans towards Sandra and, with a calculated smile, starts a conversation. She introduces herself as Margaret Hawkins, a socialite from San Francisco, involved in various charities and high-class social events. The conversation starts off friendly, But soon Margaret starts asking insinuating questions about how Sandra managed to be in that place, as if she wanted to unmask her. She asks about Sandra's work, her family, and makes subtle comments that make clear the prejudice embedded in her words. Sandra, however, remains calm and responds with dignity. She explains that she is traveling to visit her son, who is a successful entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. Margaret, visibly surprised, tries to hide her reaction, but Sandra notices the disbelief in her eyes. The conversation ends abruptly when Margaret realizes that she failed to intimidate Sandra as she intended. However, this encounter leaves Sandra reflecting on how people still judge each other based on stereotypes and prejudices. She feels even more determined to prove to everyone, including herself, that she deserves to be where she is. The flight continues smoothly, and Sandra falls asleep with these thoughts. But destiny seems to have more surprises in store for her. When the plane lands in San Francisco, Sandra prepares to disembark and finally see her son again. However, before leaving, the flight attendant approaches her and, surprisingly, apologizes for the treatment she received. He admits that he was informed about who she is and who her son is, and says he is ashamed for having acted with prejudice. Sandra accepts the apology, but makes it clear that no one should be treated with less respect, regardless of their appearance or status. She leaves the plane with her head held high, feeling victorious for having kept her dignity intact. While crossing the San Francisco airport, Sandra finally sees Michael, who is anxiously waiting for her. He welcomes her with a warm hug, full of pride and love. This reunion symbolizes not only the connection between mother and son, but also Sandra's personal victory over the prejudices she tried to face throughout her life. Sandra's arrival in San Francisco is the beginning of a new phase in her life. Michael takes her to her home, a modern mansion overlooking the bay, and introduces her to his friends and colleagues, all of whom are impressed by Sandra's strength and dignity. She begins to realize that the world Michael lives in is very different from the one she was used to. In the days that follow, Sandra is taken to events and social gatherings, where she meets influential and powerful people. Although she feels out of place at first, her confidence grows as she realizes that Michael's success is also her success. She raised a respected and admired man, and that is something no one can take away from her. However, during one of these events, Sandra is approached by a mysterious woman who introduces herself as Lydia. She says she has important information about Michael, but can only reveal it in private. Sandra, worried, agrees to meet Lydia in a cafe the next day. During this meeting, Lydia makes a shocking revelation. Michael is the target of a conspiracy within his own company. People close to him are trying to sabotage him, and Lydia, who is an employee of the company, decided to warn Sandra as she recognizes her integrity and strength. Sandra is stunned by the news, but doesn't let it shake her. She knows that she needs to protect her son and, at the same time, find a way to deal with this threat without alerting the conspirators. With Lydia's help, Sandra begins to discreetly investigate, determined to save Michael's legacy. But as Sandra delves deeper into this plot, she begins to discover secrets about Michael's past that she never imagined. Secrets that could destroy everything she believed to be true. Sandra leaves her meeting with Lydia with her mind agitated, full of questions and uncertainties. Like a protective mother, she feels compelled to act quickly to protect Michael, but Lydia's revelations also leave her confused and uneasy. She always saw Michael as a person of integrity and hard work, someone who overcame all difficulties with honesty and determination. But now, the idea that his son may be involved in something dark begins to take shape, even though he is reluctant to believe it. In the following days, Sandra acts cautiously. She continues to accompany Michael to his appointments, closely observing those around her. She also keeps in touch with Lydia, who updates her on internal movements at Michael's company. At the same time, Sandra tries to probe Michael about possible problems without arousing suspicion, but he seems unconcerned, oblivious to the approaching danger. One afternoon, while Michael is in a meeting, Sandra decides to explore the house. She wanders through the large, modern rooms, feeling small in front of all that luxury. In one of the offices, she finds an old wooden box, locked, but with the key still in the lock. Driven by curiosity, Sandra decides to open the box. Inside, she finds old letters, documents, and a photo of Michael as a teenager, next to a man she has never seen before. Upon reading the letters, Sandra discovers that the man in the photo is Richard Thompson, an influential businessman and investor who apparently mentored Michael in his early years in Silicon Valley. The letters reveal a close relationship, and, in some of them, there are indications that Richard helped Michael overcome certain financial and legal difficulties at the beginning of his career. Sandra feels a mixture of relief and discomfort when she realizes that Michael was not alone in his journey to success. Although she recognizes that no one reaches the top without help, Michael's closeness to Richard seems shrouded in a certain mystery, something he has never mentioned. As Sandra reads further, she begins to realize that the letters suggest a debt of gratitude Michael owes to Richard, something she may be aware of, directly linked to current sabotage attempts. Deciding to confront Michael, Sandra waits until the end of the day. When he finally returns, exhausted, she invites him home for a quiet dinner, something they used to do in the old days. During the meal, Sandra begins to question him about his early years in Silicon Valley, subtly asking about the difficulties he faced and the people who helped him. Michael responds naturally, mentioning Richard briefly, as if he were just a person who passed through his life. However, when Sandra asks about the box of letters, Michael becomes visibly uncomfortable. He tries to divert the subject, but Sandra insists, revealing that she read the letters and saw the photo. It is then that Michael reveals the truth. Richard was not only a mentor, but also an extremely powerful and manipulative man. For years, he helped Michael grow, but in return he demanded his unconditional loyalty. When Michael began to question Richard's methods and morality, things got complicated. Michael decided to cut ties with him, but Richard, resentful, began moving influences behind the scenes to destroy what he helped build. Sandra feels an immense weight in her heart when she hears these words. She realizes that the conspiracy Lydia mentioned is directly linked to this ancient broken alliance. Michael is in danger, not just from business competition, but from the consequences of his past choices. Now, it's up to Sandra to help him get out of this situation without losing everything they've achieved. Sandra and Michael begin planning a way to dismantle the conspiracy without alerting their enemies. Sandra, despite having no experience in the corporate world, uses her intuition and wisdom to help Michael see the traps that are being prepared. Michael, in turn, realizes that he underestimated the seriousness of the situation and thanks his mother for being by his side at this critical moment. Lydia continues to provide valuable information about the movements of Richard and his allies within the company. She reveals that Richard is trying to corrupt key members of Michael's team, offering bribes and veiled threats to sabotage important projects. Sandra and Michael decide to act quickly, and to do so, they need allies within the company who are loyal and willing to stand up to Richard. Michael calls a secret meeting with his closest and most trusted collaborators. Among them is Ethan, a young programming genius who has always admired Michael for his vision and integrity. There is also Vanessa, a shrewd lawyer who knows all the legal loopholes that can be used to protect the company. Together, they form a small resistance group, determined to expose Richard and his accomplices. At the same time, Sandra decides to act on her own. She realizes that to face a man like Richard, she needs to understand her enemy better. With Lydia's help, Sandra begins to investigate Richard's past, looking for any weaknesses or secrets that could be used against him. What she discovers, however, is something that shakes her own convictions. Sandra discovers that Richard grew up in conditions very similar to Michael's, facing poverty and prejudice. He was also a man of color, who had to fight tooth and nail to reach the top. However, unlike Michael, Richard became bitter and vengeful, using his power to manipulate and destroy those he saw as threats. This discovery leaves Sandra conflicted. She feels a strange empathy for Richard, but at the same time, she knows that he is a dangerous man who needs to be stopped. Still, this new perspective has her thinking about a different approach, one that could disarm Richard without resorting to outright destruction. Sandra decides to meet Richard in person without Michael knowing. She believes that if she can talk to him like a mother, she might be able to appeal to the human side that must still exist within him. It's a risky decision, but Sandra is willing to take that risk to protect her son. Sandra arranges a meeting with Richard in a discreet restaurant, away from the public eye. Nervous but determined, she arrives at the location a little before the scheduled time. As she waits, her mind fills with thoughts of what she will say, how she will approach such a powerful and dangerous man. But she knows she cannot show weakness, as it could cost her son's life and future. When Richard finally arrives, Sandra realizes that he is a man with a strong presence, with a cold and calculating look. He greets her politely, but there's a palpable tension in the air. They both sit down and, for a moment, silence dominates. Sandra, however, is not intimidated. She begins the conversation by mentioning her admiration for Richard's life path, recognizing how hard he had to fight to get where he is. "This beginning, my friend." Gable seems to disconcert Richard, who did not expect such an approach. Sandra then reveals that she knows about the sabotage attempt against Michael and asks Richard to stop her actions. She appeals to his human side, arguing that they are both parents who had to fight hard to secure a better future for their children. Sandra believes that there is still a chance that Richard will reconsider his actions and put revenge aside. Richard, however, remains impassive. He admits that he helped Michael at first, but that his resentment at being left out grew to the point where it became personal. He feels betrayed by Michael and believes the only way forward is the complete destruction of what he helped build. For Richard, it's a matter of pride and power. Sandra, realizing that the emotional approach did not work as she expected, decides to change her tactics. She starts talking about the consequences Richard will face if he continues his revenge. She mentions that Michael has influential allies who can retaliate, and that she herself, as a mother, is willing to fight to the end to protect her son. Sandra doesn't make direct threats, but her words carry a weight that Richard can't ignore. The meeting ends without a clear conclusion. Richard says goodbye to Sandra, but something in her gaze suggests that her words had some impact. Sandra returns home with mixed feelings. She didn't achieve a definitive victory, but she knows she planted a seed of doubt in Richard. The atmosphere at Michael's company is charged with tension, as if everyone is waiting for an approaching storm. Michael, Sandra, and their closest allies are on high alert, aware that the situation with Richard Thompson has reached a critical point. The investigations led by Lydia continue to reveal Richard's behind-the-scenes moves, which are increasingly bold and dangerous. The feeling that something big is about to happen is almost palpable. Sandra, who proved to be a fundamental player in facing the crisis, maintains her calm and determined stance. She has been a pillar of strength for Michael, advising him not to lose sight of the values that have always guided him, even under so much pressure. At the same time, she is aware that Richard's actions are about to culminate in something devastating unless they are quickly contained. The twist occurs when Sandra, in yet another of her investigations, discovers crucial information about Richard. Lydia, who has been a loyal and diligent ally, gains access to a set of confidential documents. These documents reveal not only Richard's unethical practices, but also a series of financial crimes that, if exposed, could lead to his arrest and the complete ruin of his career. The magnitude of these revelations is immense. They have the power to irreversibly destroy Richard. Sandra finds herself at a crossroads. On the one hand, this information is a powerful weapon that could guarantee the safety of Michael and his company, eliminating the threat posed by Richard once and for all. On the other hand, using this information would mean destroying a man who, despite everything, was also instrumental in Michael's early career and who, in a moment of vulnerability, showed signs of regret. Michael, still unaware of the existence of these documents, remains focused on his efforts to protect his company, unaware of the moral dilemma that Sandra is facing. She, however, decides that she needs to act before things get completely out of control. With this in mind, Sandra arranges a new meeting with Richard, without telling Michael, determined to give him one last chance to make peace and avoid an all-out war. The meeting between Sandra and Richard takes place in a discreet hotel. When Richard arrives, his posture is weary, as if recent events have finally begun to take their toll. Sandra immediately notices that something has changed in him. She starts the conversation by mentioning the documents that Lydia got. Sandra doesn't reveal everything right away, but she makes it clear that she has evidence in her hands that could ruin Richard. The tension in the room increases, but Sandra maintains her serenity. Richard, in turn, does not deny the accusations. He recognizes that in his relentless pursuit of power and control, he has crossed lines he should not have crossed. He also admits that he underestimated Sandra and Michael, believing he could manipulate them as he did so many others throughout his career. But, to Sandra's surprise, Richard shows no fear. Instead, he expresses a deep weariness, a moral exhaustion that Sandra did not expect to see. It is at this moment that Richard makes an unexpected confession. He reveals that his obsession with destroying Michael was not just out of revenge, but also because he saw in Michael the embodiment of everything he himself could never be: ethical, principled, and loved by those around him. Richard admits that deep down he always knew his ways were wrong, but that he couldn't stop, trapped in a cycle of power and self-destruction. Sandra, upon hearing this confession, feels a mixture of compassion and sadness for Richard. She realizes that, despite all the harm he has caused, Richard is also a victim of his own inordinate ambition. Sandra then decides to give him one last chance at redemption. She proposes a deal. If Richard gives up his sabotage attempts, moves away from Michael's business, and seeks a more balanced life, she undertakes not to expose the documents she has in her hands. Richard, touched by Sandra's offer, accepts the deal. He promises to withdraw from the dispute and let Michael go his way without further interference. For the first time in a long time, Richard looks relieved, as if an immense weight has been lifted from his shoulders. Sandra returns home with conflicting feelings. She knows she did the right thing by preventing mutual destruction, but she is also aware that Richard is a dangerous and unpredictable man. Still, she feels she has achieved something rare, a real change in the heart of a life-hardened man. The chapter ends with Sandra back at Michael's side, without yet revealing the details of the meeting. She watches her son working, more determined than ever, and feels that, despite everything, she managed to protect what is most important, the integrity and future of her family. Michael, who until then was unaware of his mother's encounters with Richard, begins to realize that Sandra is hiding something. She appears more reserved, as if she is carrying a heavy burden. When he finally confronts her, Sandra decides to tell him everything that happened, including her conversations with Richard and her attempts to make him reconsider his revenge. Michael is shocked and worried, but also feels a deep respect for his mother. He understands that Sandra did it to protect him and that, despite the risks, she managed to reach Richard in a way he never could. Michael then reveals that he has managed to gather more evidence against Richard, but now, with Richard's possible change of heart, he needs to decide how to proceed. The following days are marked by tense waiting. Michael and Sandra continue their lives, but with the shadow of uncertainty hanging over them. Until, one day, Richard unexpectedly shows up at Michael's company. He calls a meeting with Michael and his main allies, including Sandra. During the meeting, Richard surprises everyone by announcing that he has decided to give up his sabotage attempts. He says that, after reflecting on everything that happened, he realized that he was destroying something that he himself helped to build and that this would not bring him the peace he seeks. Richard proposes a truce and even offers his help in strengthening Michael's company. Michael, still suspicious, asks for time to consider the proposal. He discusses the matter with Sandra and her allies, pondering whether to accept the truce or use the evidence against Richard to definitively eliminate him as a threat. Sandra, however, believes that everyone deserves a second chance, including Richard. Michael is torn between his reason and his heart. On the one hand, the evidence against Richard is strong enough to completely destroy him, eliminating any future threat. On the other, Richard's sudden change in attitude and his mother's plea for a second chance make him reconsider. He knows that the decision he makes now could define not only the future of the company, but also the way he deals with power and morality for the rest of his life. As Michael ponders, Sandra advises him to listen to his instinct. She recalls difficult times in the past when crucial decisions needed to be made, and how they always found a way to move forward without sacrificing their values. Sandra believes that if Michael destroys Richard now, he will be equaling him, transforming into someone who puts revenge above all else. She reminds him that his success has always been built on integrity and ethics, and that this is the legacy he must preserve. Michael then decides to organize a final meeting with Richard, his allies, and Sandra. During this meeting, Michael gives a heartfelt speech about what it means to be a leader, about the responsibilities that come with power, and about how he has always strived to be different from those who seek to destroy rather than build. He reveals that although he has the evidence that could ruin Richard, he chooses not to use it. Instead, he proposes a true alliance, where both can work together to create something greater without grudges or ulterior motives. Richard, visibly moved, accepts the proposal. He admits that the conversation with Sandra made him see that he was on a path of self-destruction, and that this alliance is his last chance to redeem himself. Emulate and do something positive with the power you have accumulated. With this, the tension that hovered over everyone seems to dissipate, and a new era of cooperation begins. With the alliance signed, Michael's company and Richard's businesses begin to work together on projects that aim not only for profit, but also for social impact and sustainable innovation. Richard's influence opens doors that previously seemed inaccessible to Michael, and Michael's creative and ethical mind brings a new perspective to Richard's endeavors. Success is quick and significant, with both sides reaping the rewards of a collaboration based on trust and mutual respect. Sandra, in turn, sees all this with pride and satisfaction. She knows that her intervention was crucial in transforming a conflict situation into an opportunity for growth. The relationship between her and Michael strengthens even further, with both recognizing how much they learned and evolved from this experience. But the story doesn't end here. One day, while Michael and Sandra are at a charity event organized by Richard, a young woman approaches Sandra. She introduces herself as Sarah, Richard's daughter, someone Sandra didn't know existed. Sarah reveals that she has been following her father's story from afar, and that she was deeply touched by the way Sandra was able to change his heart. Sarah, who has always had a distant and complicated relationship with her father, thanks Sandra for showing her that people can change, that there is always hope for redemption. She expresses a desire to get closer to Richard and to get to know Sandra and Michael better. This unexpected meeting opens a new line of narrative where Sandra, once again, finds herself playing the role of mediator, now in a family context. The approach of Sarah and Richard, with the support of Sandra and Michael, brings a new dynamic to the story. The relationship between father and daughter, which has always been marked by resentment and misunderstanding, begins to transform into something positive and full of hope. Months later, everyone's lives are more stable and prosperous than ever. Michael's company is expanding, and he is recognized as one of the most innovative and ethical leaders of his generation. Richard, in turn, dedicates himself to philanthropic projects, trying to repair the damage he caused in the past. His relationship with Sarah continues to improve, and he finally finds peace in his personal life. Sandra decides to return to her hometown, but with plans to visit San Francisco frequently. She feels that she fulfilled her role, but knows that her presence is still necessary to maintain balance in the relationships she helped build. As they say goodbye, Michael promises that he will never stop following the values she taught him, while Richard thanks her for everything she has done, not just for Michael, but for him as well. As Sandra observes the city for the last time before boarding the plane, she feels a deep sense of satisfaction. She knows the journey was arduous, but she also knows that each challenge she faced made her stronger, wiser. She is ready for whatever the future holds, confident that with love and determination, any obstacle can be overcome. And so, Sandra Green's story reaches an exciting conclusion, but with the promise that new chapters can still be written, because life, like great soap operas, is always in motion, full of surprises and twists.